The conditions for Central American migrants fleeing to the U.S. are under unprecedented scrutiny. But while the outrage may be new, the deaths, abuses, and suffering of Central American migrants at the hands of U.S. policy is not. The conditions Central American migrants are fleeing were largely caused by the policies of both parties, Democrat and Republican. And the harsh conditions migrants are now subjected to in U.S. custody come from both parties as well. Well, to discuss this, I spoke earlier to Roberto Lovato. He is a veteran journalist and author of a forthcoming book on how decades of U.S. policy has brought about the current Central American refugee crisis. If you could start just by laying out your assessment of the state of the crisis at the U.S.-Mexico border today.
It's a relative matter because this crisis has been going on by some measure since 2014. Those of us that have actual experience with these matters can trace it back to about 30 years of crisis, consistent crisis of war, failed economic policies, and now climate change added to a domestic policy regime and immigration that has utterly humiliated and destroyed any semblance of dignity for immigrants in the United States. So between failed foreign policy for 30 years and failed domestic policy for 30 years, what you have is a continuation of a massive wave of failure. It's not the human beings that are the wave, it's the wave of failure. And I would say the decline of the United States, it's really reflected in the degenerate policies that do these things like make children drink toilet water, push children to die in the desert with their parents, to drown in rivers with their parents, to be jailed by the thousands. And then Donald Trump came after Barack Obama started us on that path. So scale is relative. Right now you have, for example, a lot of people concerned about Oscar and Valeria Ramirez, Salvadorans like me, well, not like me, they're migrants. I'm born in the U.S. I'm of Salvadoran descent. I've been down there, spent 30 years of my life on these issues. Valeria and Oscar are those. Everybody saw those images, but nobody knows that 3,000 Valeria and Oscars died between 2009 and 2017, the Obama era. There was absolute silence about that. So scale is part of the problem. People are responding to sound bites and two-dimensional images rather than to the depth of knowledge that exists in the Central American community, which is completely erased from these narratives. If you read your news, if you look online, if you see, families belong together and other groups, they don't really include Central Americans except in tactical, symbolic, and I would say sometimes even racist ways.
Let me ask you what is different then, because you've been very vocal in highlighting the continuity between the policies of Obama and Trump. But do you think that there are ways in which Donald Trump has done things that are radically different and more harsh than before?
Absolutely. No, absolutely. We need to be clear that Donald Trump is making obvious and for everyone to see the problem that has existed in the United States for decades, U.S. foreign and immigration policy that created this problem, right? So Trump adds a layer of racism that is extremely dangerous. He enables groups to be able to support these, I would even say, fascistic policies in the open, whereas, say, the Democrats' approach was to promote and institute fascistic policies when you're talking about jailing, killing, and humiliating children, like making them drink toilet water, fascistic policies, but the Democrats do it undercover. So, I mean, I hate to say it, but the fact is Donald Trump is making obvious what's been going on for some time. And he's also, like Obama, putting the abuse, the death, and the catastrophe on steroids. You have Donald Trump really, really openly, nakedly, and with a base of support of the U.S. populace, accelerating these extremely dangerous and fascistic policies that were put on steroids by the Obama administration.
So one aspect of this, as I understand it, is family separation, because you've pointed out that while family separation was not a policy under Obama, it was effectively carried out in practice. The difference now with President Trump is that he's tried to formalize family separation as an actual policy. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah. What I like to say is that at the level of rhetoric, Donald Trump is the absolute worst ever. But at the level of the physical body, the body of the child that's separated from its mother, the body of the mother that's separated from its child, Barack Obama broke records to the tune of, for example, in 2011, the Obama administration separated 5,100 children from their parents, according to Race Forward. And there are other studies that show thousands more were separated by the Obama administration in reports that, say, for example, the Lutheran Immigration Agency put out. So, yeah, you have family separation as a policy attempted by Trump and then rejected in the courts, and you have family separation as a practice to the tunes of thousands as a definitive fact of life in the bodies of migrants and their migrant kids and their mothers, refugees. So I would encourage people, look at the body, look at the separated body, look at the drowned body, look at the dehydrated body, look at the bodies of migrants. Just don't listen to the rhetoric, because when you look at the level of the body, then you begin seeing the continuum that I'm talking about, a continuum that doesn't start solely with Obama. I mean, you could even trace it to the creation of Homeland Security at one level of repression. But then you can also go back to the Clinton era in '96, when the anti-terrorist law made being a migrant a criminal act, rather than, simply a kind of a misdemeanor that migrants were a part of. So this is a continuum of policy, but I really like to focus, because the clearest example to the terror and devastation that Donald Trump is instituting is in the terror and devastation that Barack Obama instituted between 2009 and 2011. To those people that would want to call this whataboutism, right? Because you see this kind of talking point put out by Democratic Party operatives and simpaticos. I really think that is murderous rhetoric when you consider 3,000 deaths between 2010 and 2017. 74 migrants died, according to Human Rights Watch, in Obama's detention. Call that whataboutism. Children drowning, children forced to drink toilet water, 2,000 or more children raped between 2015 and 2016 in Obama prisons, and adults, 2,000 adults and children raped, according to the very left-leaning Department of Justice of the United States.
I want to ask you about U.S. obligations here. On top of the legal obligations that we have towards asylum seekers, I'm wondering if you feel, given the legacy of U.S. foreign policy that you've touched on, if there's a moral obligation here as well. And if so, if you could lay out for us what you think have been the main impacts of U.S. foreign policy on the Central American refugee crisis.
Well, when I think of U.S. policy, I think of an adobe house that I saw bombed in 1990 that contained like about 10 people in Chalatenango province in the rural El Salvador. And, mostly kids were killed. And these were people that had already fled the war and returned to Chalatenango. And if you look at the esquirlas, the shrapnel of those bombs that completely destroyed these children and their parents who were refugees, those were made in the USA. The military that killed them was trained by the United States. And that military and its death squads that were also supported by the Reagan administration and even the Carter administration killed the majority of the 80,000 people. 85% of the people killed in El Salvador, for example, during the war were killed by their own government, according to the United Nations Truth Commission report in 1993. The same thing with Guatemala and the crimes against humanity perpetrated by the Contra extremists in Nicaragua. So you have billions of dollars spent to destroy the economies and people of Central America in the 80s. You have failed policies prior to that in terms of economics and militarization. You have, after those wars, increased, when we enter the Clinton era of immigration and foreign policy, you have failed economic policies, neoliberal economics, that, for example, start us on the path to mass migration from the countryside. And then you have the criminalization of migrants through what scholars like Juliet Stumpf at Lewis and Clark call crimmigration, that begins with Bill Clinton in 96. So in the 90s, you start seeing increased deaths in the desert, like what I saw in those deserts. I visited Mexico, where there were mass graves of Central Americans pushed to their deaths by U.S. policy in southern Mexico. And so then let's move to the 2000s. You have U.S. policy under Bush and then Obama accelerating the patterns of failed foreign policy and massification of destruction of migrant child and adult life through immigration policy. So does all that merit some sort of an apology? I would think it begins with a moral fact of the United States' absolute responsibility for mass destruction of Central America, including even creating the gangs and the gang problem in Central America, right? When I was in LA, when LAPD was arresting gang members, handing them over illegally to ICE, or Immigration and Naturalization back then, and then deporting them to countries that the United States destroyed with bombs and failed economic policies.
Roberto Lovato, journalist, author of a forthcoming book on how decades of U.S. policy has caused the current Central American refugee crisis. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Aaron.